Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. Welcome. There will be a few people straggling in both actually and virtually. But I think we should get going because we only have about an hour for this conversation. So welcome everybody to a public lecture that is both usual and unusual. It's usual in the sense that the CSRS often features scholars working on themes that are connected to interdisciplinary research projects that are the core of our mandate. In this case, this lecture is the first of two public lectures of a small workshop in which a group of experts is thinking through the implications of relatively new features of contemporary spirituality for conventional healthcare. The second talk takes place tomorrow at 5 p.m. in the Elliott Building and features the work of Dr. Andrea Jain. Now, the lecture is unusual, of course, in the sense that it is at a very strange time. It's in a massive room to allow for social distancing with a speaker in a different hemisphere. However, through the wonders of Zoom, high-speed internet, and a really excellent staff at the center, we can make it work, we think. So far, so good. And so I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's speaker. Jane Mcnaughton is Professor of Medical Humanities at Durham University and just completed her term as Director of the Institute for Medical Humanities. She recently began a role as Deputy Vice Provost for Research at Durham. She was part of the core group that set up the Association for Medical Humanities in 2000, and she edited the journal Medical Humanities from 2002 to 2008. She has a distinguished publication record in bioethics, clinical judgment, medicine, art, and anatomy. Her clinical work is in women's health, and her most recent research project was The Life of Breath, in which she investigated the symptom of breathlessness, which seems like a simple medical fact, but is actually far more complicated than that. Today, she will take us into that project and issues related to the conversations we're having in the workshop. And before I turn the screen over to Jane, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now I'll turn it over to Jane, and you can share a screen and take it away. Everyone else, please just remain muted to make sure that we can focus on Jane. Thanks, everybody. Take it away, Jane.
Thanks very much, Paul. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I clear enough? Yep, getting some thumbs up and things. I'm going to share my screen now. Make sure that that's kind of coming up. Oh, wrong one. Is that the right screen I'm sharing?
Yeah, you just need to put it on slideshow.
Slideshow, which it is now. Going
Okay,
on slideshow.
perfect.
Jolly good, excellent. Well, it's great. I echo what Paul just said about excellent stuff, because I had long conversations with Rachel, goodness, about probably 2 years ago now, Rachel, about organizing my travel and accommodation to come and spend some time with you during this workshop. And I'm really very sorry not to be able to make my very first travel to Canada and to your beautiful part of the world. So I'm sorry not to be there. It's just very strange sitting here in my own house and interacting with my dog and then coming here to do this lecture. I've never quite got used to it. I've done it a few times now, but it's quite strange. But anyway, it's wonderful to be here. And I'm going to really kind of, we had a session earlier on this evening in the workshop, which kind of raised some themes, which I hope my lecture will kind of touch on as well. But I'm going to kind of move us a little bit, because I think that's part of because of the COVID pandemic, the workshop sort of moved into thinking a bit more about COVID and post-COVID and how the whole realm of sort of deinstitutionalizing structures, particularly with relevance to religion and spirituality, might impact. So clearly, when Paul asked me to do this, I was a bit nervous about it, because I don't have any expertise or knowledge in the fields of theology or spirituality. But, you know, that's been taken care of by a huge number of experts over the next couple of days. So what I want to do from my perspective as a medical humanities scholar and a clinician is to contextualize our discussions within this wider picture of the arts, of the relationship between the arts, humanities, social sciences, and medicine, and why our contributions matter in this difficult time. These times might offer us opportunities to build new post-COVID futures, what I have to say, I think might connect quite well with Anna and Paul's session this afternoon, evening for me on conspirituality, and also with Linda and Isabel's session tomorrow on creativity and care. I'll say a bit more about that later. But thinking about the relevance of the arts and humanities disciplines, in a recent blog post, Kristen Osler, who's professor of English at Rice University in the USA, picked out a couple of key contributions of the arts and humanities might make to the COVID crisis. One is to give historical and cultural context to the pandemic. She says we must learn to construct meaningful narratives that link human behavior to data about disease, thus setting what's happening within a larger historical picture. And the second is a more forward-looking idea, helping us to understand how our decisions about whose life matters will shape the future to come. And this, Osler argues, is a critical value of the arts and humanities because they place health within its wider social, economic, cultural, religious, and ethnic context. Crucially, they are able to craft compelling stories that call out, for example, systemic racism, but also enable us to imagine how life might be in the future. Now, this is a persuasive thesis and one that's reflected in a great deal of activity in online conferences and workshops that have been taking place in the arts and humanities in the wake of COVID, a bit like this one here. One such initiative is that by the British Academy here in the UK called Shape the Future. The SHAPE acronym stands for Social Sciences, Humanities and the Arts for People and the Economy. And it's set against STEM, which as we know is science, technology, engineering and math, sometimes with medicine added in there as a second M. The BA held a series of workshops summarized here in this diagram, which led to 5 key principles for policymakers and researchers. And these included the importance of using a broad knowledge base in policymaking, not just focusing on the medical, biological, and physical, the importance of being responsive to local and historical contexts, and a renewed focus on inequalities and inclusivity, sustainability, and the environment in our post-COVID planning. So very much like Oster, there's an emphasis on awareness of the need for broadening the sources of knowledge that might inform a post-COVID recovery, and a sense that this awareness brings with it a responsiveness to local and cultural context, circumstances, and needs. But I think there's a bigger ambition to be articulated here, and one that this workshop, I hope, is wishing to embrace, and that's a desire not just to uncover the problem, but to address it, to actually be involved in articulating the nature of experience, in our case, spiritual experience, and imagining a post-COVID future and helping to build it. So just turning a bit to the background on medical humanities. Medical humanities has tended first and foremost to be associated with the ways in which the arts and humanities help us to understand health. And in as much as it's intervened in healthcare, traditionally medical humanities' role has been in the education of practitioners. And here we have the Howard Brody's kind of conception of the kind of value of the medical humanities. First of all, he articulates it as a list of disciplines. So we've got sort of theology, history, English literature, music, and their applications and what they might tell us about medicine, or how they might support learning in medicine. We've got a program of moral development, which is the leaning on the arts to kind of teach us about moral values, about ways of living, which I think the kind of ethics field has been particularly focused on. And the third is a notion of a supportive friend. So the idea that the exhausted clinician at the end of a busy day at the coalface would come back home and listen to music or read a novel, and would be soothed and supported by this. But this approach that Brody articulates in this article, while being of value, influences only the way in which clinicians might practice, and it has no effect on what they actually do. So our institute in Durham has been central to evolving a new conception of medical humanities, which we've called critical medical humanities. Now, the approach of critical medical humanities is one that genuinely takes seriously the fact that the knowledge and methods of the arts and humanities are not just an add-on, an enhancement to clinical practice, but they have serious things to say about how ill health is produced across a range of sites and scales, and indeed how to tackle it. And I'm just going to quote from an article that my colleagues wrote in 2015, articulating this new conception. And they suggest that medical humanities should intervene more explicitly in questions of etiology, pathogenesis, intervention, and cure, rather than leaving such questions largely to the domains of the life sciences and biomedicine. Despite its name, critical medical humanities is not just out to critique, to say to biomedicine, you've got it all wrong, because patently that's not true, as the success of the vaccine program around the world and so many other examples show, but to work in tandem with other disciplines, including biomedicine, in order to find new ways of addressing ill health. And I think somebody mentioned earlier on the idea of health humanities. I think I've always felt that health humanities has tended to kind of scar the idea of medical humanities as being very much more to do with the kind of medical endeavor. And not so. I think medical humanities and health humanities probably got a lot more in common. The reason why we chose to stick with medical humanities as a terminology was because the journal held it. Our major funder, the Wellcome Trust here in the UK, held this, and it had become a kind of expression that I think that people recognised and to a certain extent understood. So we stuck with it, but I'm very happy for us to talk about health humanities as well. So just to say a bit more about the kind of work we do at Durham, at our institute, we research what we think of as the hidden experience of illness. And I think this will tell you a bit more about how we go about things in the critical medical humanities. So hidden experience, it means health issues that may be hidden for a wide range of reasons. They might be hidden because the person experiencing the problem doesn't identify the symptoms as part of a pathological process. And one example might indeed be breathlessness, which is something that happens because you smoke or you're getting older. It's part of a kind of normal process, and people don't actually identify it as a problem. And problems can be hidden also to the external world because of stigma related to, for example, mental health. And illness can be hidden because medicine has not got the right tools to reveal it, such as when people experience medically unexplained symptoms, and possibly the new condition of long COVID, although that's getting a lot more attention, much to the chagrin of people who suffered from medically unexplained symptoms for years. And also when there are aspects of people's experience that may impact upon their illness, which are hidden because clinicians don't have the skills and knowledge to understand or even ask about it. And that may well be the case with spiritual experience, as we've already kind of discussed, and religious practice. Clinicians aren't often very well clued up about how to think or ask about those aspects of people's experience. And here's a couple of examples of our work, which I'll touch upon later. First of all, a project called Hearing the Voice, which explores the experience of hearing a voice in the absence of any speaker. Language is important here. This is known to medicine as auditory verbal hallucinations, but it's something that commonly occurs, as I'm sure many of you know, to people who have no psychiatric diagnosis, particularly following bereavement. And the project team includes people from theology, psychology, psychiatry, literary studies, medieval studies, history, and also writers, artists, musicians, and clinicians. And the second project that I'll mention later as well, take some examples from, is The Life of Breath, which I lead. And this is designed to explore the experience of breathlessness, involving, as you see here, people in clinical medicine, literary studies, history, philosophy, anthropology, and people with experience, and also artists. And pictured there beside me is my co-I on that project, Professor Javi Carroll, who's a philosopher from the University of Bristol. So reflecting on this, we can see that what the COVID pandemic has revealed above all is is what the field of critical medical humanities has always insisted upon, and that is the deep entanglement of social, cultural, historical, spiritual life with the biomedical. What is fascinating about the current crisis, if it wasn't so devastating, is the fact that historians and cultural commentators are watching these elements of our collective lived experience connect and disconnect in real time. It's a bit like watching history in fast forward, and it makes academic researchers quite wary of commenting too quickly or with authority on what's going on or overseeing it. It's interesting that the COVID pandemic in some circles is now being referred to as a syndemic. That is when two or more concurrent or sequential disease clusters take place in a population, adding further insult to injury, as we've seen with the interactions of COVID and health inequalities and systemic racism. And I want to illustrate what I mean by this entanglement by focusing on some key points of discussion during the COVID pandemic. First of all, responses to the inequalities revealed by COVID and the relationship between religious belief and vaccine hesitancy, which I know we'll talk about a bit later on. So the experiential and allied emotional trajectory of the pandemic has taken different shapes across nations, but there have been some commonalities. Aslam et al. Examined over 140,000 news headlines from major international news outlets from December 2019 to June 2020, and noticed a preponderance of headlines in the negative sentiment category, not surprisingly, with the commonest negative words being pandemic, Trump, outbreak, and virus. The word fear, as you can see from this, also prominently features as a fear of death, but actually, interestingly, less so as a fear of the key symptom of COVID, which is breathlessness. This, or allied words such as breath, somewhat surprisingly don't feature amongst the negatively emotive words. From a medical humanities perspective, however, the idea of breath as a critical function for life and as a metaphor for our times has been central during the period of the pandemic, signaling the way in which we as humans are united, but also how we are different. At the outset of the pandemic, people comforted themselves with a sense of solidarity and a feeling we're all in it together. But this soon collapsed as it became clear that the virus was killing more people from BAME communities and areas of lower socioeconomic disadvantage. These COVID-orientated concerns about breath gained metaphorical force in May 2020, when George Floyd, a Black American man, died after a police officer in Minneapolis knelt on his neck, compressing his trachea for almost 8 minutes. His final words, "I can't breathe," echoing those of another victim, Eric Garner, became a rallying call for the new anti-racist movement, Black Lives Matter, that galvanized people across the globe to gather in protest marches despite the COVID threat. So these connected themes of breath with its existential and spiritual overtones, suffocation, post-colonial oppression, silencing, inequality, have all come together during the period of the pandemic, crossing clinical, scholarly, and public discourse, and political discourse indeed. They have stimulated significant calls across these fields for change and pathways to a new, more equal and caring future. One such response comes from the prominent UK epidemiologist Sir Michael Marmot, whose 2020 report, Build Back Fairer, the COVID Marmot Review, proposes a way forward to address the searing health inequalities emphasized by the epidemic. Within the academy, the call for decolonizing the curriculum has become louder, and more attention is being paid by the global north to scholars with authoritative voices from the south. The Cameroon philosopher and theorist Akil Mbembe summarizes the current mood in his short essay, The Universal Right to Breathe. He catches the sense, also in the Marmot report and across lay and other media, of a need not just to return to normal, but to shape a new normal. In his essay, Mbembe concludes, before this virus, humanity was already threatened with suffocation. If war there must be, it cannot so much be against a specific virus as against everything that condemns the majority of humankind to a premature cessation of breathing, everything that fundamentally attacks the respiratory tract, everything that in the long reign of capitalism has constrained entire segments of the world's population, entire races, to a difficult panting breath and life of oppression. To come through this constriction would mean that we conceive of breathing beyond its purely biological aspect and instead as that which we hold in common, that which, by definition, eludes all calculation, by which I mean the universal right to breath. So these entangled themes of breath, suffocation, silencing, inequality have formed a backdrop to the fast-moving story of COVID infection and vaccine rollout, I think, across the world, but certainly in the UK. The fact that BAME and disadvantaged groups were particularly vulnerable to infection and indeed death did not seem initially to inform the rollout of the vaccine in the UK. Our programme started in early December 2020, but it wasn't until much later in January 21 that the first alarm calls began to sound from GPs whose close relationship with their patients enabled them to understand this hesitancy. One GP reported 20 to 30% do not attends amongst the BAM community compared to 2 to 3% in other groups. Concerns reported were the speed with which the vaccine had been developed, fair enough, anxieties about permanent side effects, and religious concerns about whether the vaccine contained alcohol or porcine products. And some advance warning had been available about this issue. The UK Royal Society for Public Health carried out a survey of the public in early December 2020 to find out their attitudes about taking the vaccine. And disturbingly, they found that only 57% of BAME respondents said they would get the vaccine, compared to 84% of people who identified as white. The report warned that if these findings were not acted upon, they may exacerbate pre-existing health inequalities. The question then arises as to why those rolling out the programme had to rush to alter approaches on populations of concern at a later date. The answer to this may lie in the dominance of a biomedical approach that does not necessarily take seriously the deep-rooted cultural issues and systems of belief that determine how people act in relation to health problems. Medicine works on the assumption that evidence drives action. Clinicians are guided by this, and patients are assumed to respond appropriately. The COVID vaccine has high efficacy, therefore we should all accept it as the most effective way out of the pandemic. But there are proximal and distal reasons why certain groups might not respond in this way. Most articles in the clinical and public health press acknowledge the proximal upfront issues, such as lack of trust. The answer to this problem of the fact that certainly in the UK, we didn't act quickly enough to anticipate these kinds of problems may lie in the dominance of a biomedical approach that doesn't necessarily take seriously the deep-rooted cultural issues and systems of belief that determine how people act in relation to health problems. So medicine works on this assumption that evidence drives action. Clinicians are guided by this. Patients are assumed to respond. The COVID vaccine has a high efficacy, therefore we should accept it as the best way to deal with the pandemic. And I think that I talked a bit about the kind of proximal issues, the kind of upfront issues like trust, safety, and problems of access. And these kind of problems require these practical, immediate solutions, mobilizing local knowledge, personal connections, trusted community champions, and faith leaders to emphasize safety and demonstrate their own commitment to the vaccine. But there are other more deep-seated, hidden, or what we might call distal issues. They're more difficult to address, but also to identify in the first place. And it may be possible to address the specific problem of lack of trust by bringing in local leaders, faith leaders, and champions. But this is an approach that will not counter the long-standing and deep-seated problem of structural racism that, intersecting with socioeconomic disadvantage, has been the underlying cause of differential COVID susceptibility, as well as hesitancy. the assumption that all communities trust authority and will respond like us, i.e. the included white, middle class, and by implication reasonable citizen, may well demonstrate structural racism in action. Far from acknowledging and building this understanding into the vaccine programme, a recent controversial UK report appeared to deny the existence of structural racism, concluding that inequalities associated with COVID were entirely owing to socioeconomic disadvantage. And in the US, of course, this vaccine hesitancy has also been a function of what's become known as Christian nationalism. The online journal The Conversation reported in April 2021 that white evangelicals were the religious group least likely to say they'd be vaccinated against COVID. Nearly half said they would not get the jab, against 30% in the general population. And I know we'll hear more about this trend in the conspirituality session with Anna and Paul later. But it again illustrates the way in which COVID has become entangled with a developing cultural tendency to distrust science, medicine, expertise more generally, and what might be regarded as an institutional elite. This lack of trust in institutions is problematic. The vaccine programme operates on the assumption that individuals are willing to take action in the present to prevent a future undesired event from happening, such as infection with COVID. The anthropologist Vincent Adams has gone so far as to suggest that this anticipatory episteme has become a defining quality of our current moment. She was actually writing before the pandemic, suggesting that this defining quality is its characteristic state of anticipation, of thinking and living towards the future. At that time, this insight was directed towards things like risky health behaviours that might lead to problems in later life, but it's wholly appropriate for our current context, as Adams, and I think I've still got I'm just going to quit. Sorry, that was bad. I'm back in again. Yeah, I just got rid of some noises. Adams and colleagues say, anticipation is not just betting on the future, it's a moral economy in which the future sets the conditions of possibility for action in the present, in which the future is inhabited in the present. However, history can have profound effects on how people differentially experience the current moment, with consequences on how they might act. The experience of the last year and a half has been profoundly different for individuals and communities variously exposed to the economic, emotional, spiritual, and physical threats offered by the virus. The experience has been intense for many, with countries in and out of lockdown, with its implications for additional childcare, loss of employment, and economic austerity for already vulnerable groups. The assumption that individuals are willing to take the kind of anticipatory action required by the vaccine programme may not take into account the experience of people in communities whose lives may be characterised less by an orientation towards the future, but by living day to day with immediate concerns about job precarity or access to food. And in addition, the vaccine programme asks people not only to consider our own individual good in having a jab, but also the wider benefits to the population. Vaccine hesitancy has been described as a threat to the success of the programme in suppressing the virus nationally and ultimately internationally. Such language, though often expressed by clinicians in respectful terms, may also serve to exacerbate a them and us culture already ingrained through historical othering of ethnic and religious groups and compounded by more immediate accusations of selfishness and stupidity. Such an atmosphere of division might not necessarily lend itself to actions in favour of a wider good. So taking into account perspectives that are not governed by the tenets of evidence-based medicine or presumptions about the sameness of people's lived experience is crucial for uncovering these deep-seated reasons for vaccine hesitancy. Public health approaches to vaccine uptake have been on the back foot in responding because of the complex, entangled historical, religious, and cultural background to hesitancy. There's a role for critical medical humanities here to help uncover the hidden nature of this problem, and also a responsibility of the field to engage in finding solutions. So I hope it's clear from my argument so far that that one value of the medical humanities is to try to disentangle the elements that make up our culture, especially healthcare culture, and be aware there's several powers to influence how individuals and groups may act in relation to major crises such as COVID. I've also suggested that the COVID pandemic demonstrates clearly the meaning of culture, that it's not a static entity, as I've suggested, but is produced and evolved through interaction and relationship. As the critic Terry Eagleton reminds us, one of the original meanings of the word culture was husbandry, or the tending of natural growth. This suggests, says Eagleton, both regulation and spontaneous growth. The culture is what we can change, he says, but the stuff to be altered has its own autonomous existence, which then lends it something of the caltrance of nature. But culture is also a matter of following rules, and this too involves an interplay of the regulated and unregulated. So I think these ideas speak strongly to the theme of our workshop, that of a loosening of institutional religious rules, alignments, and religious ways of life, which were already going on, but have been expanded through the pandemic by an opening out of new ways of experiencing and defining religious spiritual life, and by the making of new institutions and rules for living. The COVID pandemic has provided a strong impetus for this, as people have had time to reflect on their ways of living, and illustrated this with a huge uptake of online yoga sessions, for example. Yoga with Adrienne Mishler has 7 million YouTube followers. And there's been an explosion, as we talked about, of mindfulness and meditation activities. But there's also been some tightening and closing up of structures, rejecting public health advice on the basis of religious belief. It's important to pay attention to this as the context of something frightening. People, in the context of something frightening, people may feel the need to believe in a higher authority or power other than governments in whom to invest trust. So what medical humanities does is shake up and destabilize the sentences of medical culture through calling upon the knowledge, methods, and creativity of the humanities, social science, and the arts. And this shaking up is not intended to be destructive, but constructive of creating new cultures that enable people to thrive in challenging circumstances and able to imagine more flourishing futures. So I'm going to illustrate this, and I'm just aware of time a bit, with reference to 2 examples from our work at Durham, working with self-help groups. It reminds me a bit of our discussion with about kind of chaplaincy developing. So self-help groups taking responsibility for their own health. I think it might kind of speak to our discussions. So I mentioned our Wellcome Trust-funded Hearing the Voice project earlier on. This project has been groundbreaking and taken seriously, not only the idea that hearing a voice in the absence of any speaker can be part of normal human experience, but it's worked very closely with the Hearing Voices Network, and it's engaged with voice hearers who reject the dominant medical discourse around their experiences and seek to explore and express their own recovery narratives. They are the experts by experience on their voices, and they assert the right to make sense of them in relation to that experience, to find their own meanings and shared meanings within the network. And it's here that my colleague Adam Powell argues that we may enter the world of the sacred. With this turn to a collective search for meaning and agency, Powell argues, voice hearers necessarily reject existing systems whilst formulating new ones, undertaking what anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss would have termed a kind of conversion, in which an individual, having been deemed a patient, emerges as one cured, or at least in control of their own cure. According to Levi-Strauss, the success of this process of conversion lies in the collectively validated articulation of the problem by the group, not in the empirically validated solution of medicine. So our medical humanities approach supports this validation by untangling the individual and collective experience from the confines of conventional medical dominance, supporting the creation of a new culture that does not reject the benefits of a clinical approach, but enables us to coexist with a group-inspired culture that respects powerfully individualized stories of empowerment and recovery. And finally, to take me back to the Life of Breath project that I mentioned earlier, and this example I want to make here drills down more effectively to illustrate how medical humanities can work to identify the kinds of blocks to progress that people living with chronic illness might experience within a medicalized context. So a key challenge in managing chronic breathlessness as a symptom is poor uptake of the major evidence-based treatment, which is pulmonary rehabilitation. Now, this approach, which is because chronic breathlessness really can't be cured, this approach involves people exercising in order to improve their lung function in the way that any of us would do, or at least to sustain it and to stop it from declining. Now, exercise is always challenging for people with breathlessness, but very difficult for them. And our work involving anthropologists and literary scholars and philosophers provided further insights as to why the uptake of this program, as you can see from this diagram, is poor. For example, we discovered that people found the language of pulmonary and rehabilitation very off-putting and very stigmatizing. In addition to that, the gym, which is where this treatment was carried out, was not culturally a familiar space for them. And the other key to our understanding was the idea of understanding how people's bodies felt to them, a kind of phenomenological sense of the interoceptive awareness that people had of their own bodies. Interoception is the sense of the functioning of your own body. And so in response to these insights, we proposed that dance activity might be a solution. Dance is culturally more familiar to people. The language was not stigmatizing. And most of all, it might give people whose bodies have become a burden a sense that there was some pleasure to be had with the body, a sense the body might again be beautiful. So we collaborated with this local Breathe Easy support group in a local town near us with a dance teacher. And we produced a journal article co-wrote. And these few slides I hope will show you just how much fun people were having. With music, it seems to flow better. When I'm dancing, I'm no longer myself. I'm my right and my left. I'm my movement. I forget I'm ill. I prefer dance to exercise. There's something about the movements that seem to be more sedate and strengthening. And this Wordle diagram that the group made up themselves will give you a sense of what the key issues here were for them. Friendship, laughter, happiness, inspiration, movement, joy, dance, I think is really important. So this research on this project demonstrated for me two key insights that I think are really important to underline the potential transformative effect of a very different approach to managing a public health problem that's driven by medical humanities. First of all, it was an artist, not a doctor, who led the treatment, the dance treatment program. And that was important because artists see the person not as a patient, as a problem to be solved or a difficulty, but as somebody with creative potential to learn, to develop new understanding or new ways of moving and enjoying the body. I think as Geraldine spoke about in our previous session, about spiritual coaches, appreciating the agency of the individual to bring about their own responses and treatment and recovery. And secondly, these interactions reminded us that the lived experience is a dynamic thing. Human beings are not the static entities that you see in the clinic, a problem needing solved by clinician input alone, but they need to be conceptualized in constant conversation with their social, cultural, and environmental surroundings. And this is where some work by the anthropologist Tim Ingold, I think, comes in. In his book, Biosocial Becomings, he reflects on the kind of impasse created by regarding human beings through the traditional institutional medical culture in a machine-like way initiated the Enlightenment. And he suggests that we think differently. We think of ourselves as beings, not as beings, but as becomings, not as discrete and preformed entities, but are trajectories of movement and growth. And he goes on to say life is a task, and it's one which we have perpetually, never-endingly and collaboratively to be creating ourselves. Medical humanities, engaging with a range of cultures that produce and support both health and illness, and challenging the institutional rules and assumptions that medicine lays down, can transform ways of improving health by focusing not on the problem, but on the potential for growth and development that human becomings possess. And so just coming to a conclusion, actually, with this kind of collection of thoughts, which I hope have some relevance to how we're thinking, as we move into a post-COVID future, there's hopefulness, despite all the kind of problems and the ways in which we've been interacting. People are continually developing, responding, shifting, changing, challenging institutional behaviours, creating new ones. And in all this process, we recognise that people have the potential as becomings, not as beings, to become something more, become something different, to take a new turn in their life, even in the context of chronic illness. And I think this is really important in a post-COVID situation. And I'm sure it is really critical when you're thinking about people's spiritual development as they take on new ways, new institutional ways of being. But I think the important thing that we in medical humanities would like to assert is that you don't want to chuck away some of the really valuable things that the institutions such as medicine can offer. The important thing is to work in an entangled fashion to get the benefits of all these things, and in terms of research, I think, to integrate and to work together. And that's why interdisciplinarity is so important in these contexts. And I think I'll come to a conclusion then, just to give us a bit of time for questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jane. That was a great talk. I really appreciate it. So we have about 10 minutes or so before lunch for some questions or conversation from folks, because I think, Jane, you're probably going to sleep after this, is my guess.
Well, I'm very interested to come to this con-spirituality, but I might go down and have some dinner before I come to that. Yeah.
You could always show up in your pajamas or something.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
As a pre-bed ritual. But anyway, nice. So lovely to have you back for that, for sure. So questions or comments? There's a microphone in the middle, or you can just wave at me and I'll re-ask your question. One question I had is that Andrea Jane this morning was referring to the question of structural inequalities and injustices, which in some sense you touched on for sure. Yeah. And I wonder, clinically, if medical humanities is entangled, as you put it, toward the end, or ought to be entangled with the clinical as well as the philosophical, the literary, the artistic, and so forth. How does one, a clinician in your case, how does one speak to those structural inequalities or barriers that are so embedded in our societies, and which do result in very dramatically different vaccine uptake, yes, for example?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a real challenge about the kinds of assumptions that I spoke about in the talk, where they're just that clinical medicine, and it's a field I come from myself, makes these kinds of assumptions about the ways in which people will act in relation to an imperative that's out there. And I think the culture of medicine, and we have to regard it as a culture, has this very strong and very dominating view that that's the rational approach, and that rationality and the evidence will naturally win out. You just need to keep telling people this is the right thing to do. Look at the evidence. But I think really that medical humanities has this role to sort of say, well, hang on a minute. There are all these potential issues that, if you start to kind of delve deeper underneath the kind of assumptions that we make and look at the experience, and this is why in the Institute at Durham, we focus so much on on experience, because, you know, we assume as medics, in a sense, that we kind of can understand people's experience. Well, it's just, you know, if you've got diabetes, well, there's a certain number of symptoms and problems you might have. Well, no, you don't actually. You don't know what it's like for somebody living in a particular environment, in a particular house with a particular family. You can't get at that. So it really, I mean, and this is why there's a lot of anthropologists in our group, and this is why anthropology is such an important issue. But I think one of the things that's critical for us is not just to kind of stop at that, but to say, okay, what are the implications for understanding that on the ways in which we deliver services? And I remember back in the later 90s, before I moved to Durham, I was working in Glasgow with a woman who was an obstetrician who laid on services for women with really quite severe social problems, particularly drug use and alcohol abuse. And she realized that the only way to get those women to use a service was to take the service out to them, not to sit in the hospital waiting for them to come to it, because that was never going to work. And of course, so that's the kind of thinking that we have to start with the experience of the individuals. If we think we're not reaching them, well, okay, what are the reasons for that? How can we start to manage services, deliver services that are appropriate for the individuals that we need to deal with? And I mean, there's so much else to say there, but those are the kinds of things that I think we should be doing.
Thank you. Yeah, Trevor.
Thank you, Jane, for the incredible talk. So I did a historical case study of a children's hospital. This is research that I conducted, and I looked at this was a religious hospital started by Episcopalian women in Ohio. They led the hospital. They were the managers for about 3 decades. And then the hospital professionalized, and the doctors, the very wealthy donors come in, and they saw trade-offs between professional medicine versus this more religious approach to healthcare. Ultimately, the doctors took over, and the founding coalition of the organization died off. And so, coming from that, with that in the back of my mind, I guess the question I have is, how do we organize healthcare in a setting like a hospital, in a way that can integrate these approaches that we talked about, to a humanistic approach to medicine versus a more scientific approach?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Trevor. And I think some of that speaks to the kinds of discussions we were having earlier, and also the kinds of experience of these self-help groups. I mean, for instance, I mentioned the Hearing Voices Network, because there, you know, that was an example of a group of people taking their problem almost entirely outside of the institutions of medicine, and trying to derive their own recovery through telling their own stories and sharing their own stories. And I mean, to accept that's great, but I think still people with severe problems that some of those individuals had do need to still engage with the structures of clinical medicine. But the critical point here, I think, is again, it takes me back to the dominance of the biomedical approach. And a lot of this is to do with education, I think, about, you know, and I started out my life in medical humanities as an educator of undergraduates. Well, undergraduates in our sentence, in the US, it would be kind of postgraduates, but as a medical educator. And I think there is still an issue in medical education of people understanding the evidence base of medicine as being entirely science generated. And what medical humanities is trying to do is to say, well, actually, in order to deliver what's needed for human beings who experience healthcare, we need to gather the full panoply of knowledge and use the full panoply of methodologies that come from across the disciplines to inform us of what's needed. So, you know, we need to understand religious experience. We need to be able to draw upon the expertise that comes from that. We need to draw upon the kind of knowledge about human experience that resides in literary stories as well. To kind of get, I mean, I've got a PhD student who's looking at memoirs, literary memoirs of people with medically unexplained symptoms, and what she's learning from that is amazing. So I think it's this sense of kind of broadening that base of understanding that we need to bring this in. And I think what we've been trying to do in our critical medical humanities project is to genuinely demonstrate what can come about if you engage across the science as well as these other areas. What can you generate that will actually be valuable and worthwhile for people suffering from various clinical problems? And so, I mean, you're talking there about a hospital which has got a sort of structure, an institutional structure, but the problem that presumably that change took place, that shift towards the more professionalized medical aspect took place because the medics didn't trust sufficiently to work more closely with the religious practitioners within the context. And I wonder whether, I think hospices, people have been talking a bit about hospices. Hospices are probably a very good model for that, because hospices are not really so much interested in evidence-based medicine. They're interested in symptom control. They're not necessarily interested in pathology. They want to just make people, feel better. They want to look after people. They're interested in a range of humanistic approaches. And they're a good model, I think, for the kinds of ways in which we should be using that across the piece, I think.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jane. I think one of the things that, just by way of a final question, our last session was about privilege and some of the internal critiques of privilege. We had the critique of the privilege of Christian chaplains, but you were mentioning the way in which people talk now about health humanities, and you were critical of that shift. And I wonder if part of that shift is a function of an internal critique of a particular kind of privilege of the medical, right? I mean, I think the category itself turns off some people. And, but is there anything lost in sticking with the medical humanities category as opposed to health humanities more broadly?
Well, we've struggled with this, and I think we've come to the conclusion in Durham, and that we've kind of gone too far down the line, that we have an identity that is that medical humanities, and so many people do criticize the medical word, but in many ways, and you're right, we would argue that the medical stands for the health, but then we could be critiqued for that, because health is not about medicine, and we should maybe kind of make a shift. But I mean, when I look at what the health humanities groups say about what they do and how they define it, it's exactly the same as how we would define medical humanities. So it's a wrong kind of implication that we are focusing entirely on a kind of medical context. But it may change. I mean, a new person has just taken over the institute that I used to direct. It's not that I've kind of banged on and said we desperately must have the title being medical humanities, but so we may change, and there may be a kind of pressure to do that. But I think you're right. I mean, there's no doubt that medicine holds a privileged position within health culture. Particular aspects of medicine hold privileged positions within medicine as well, but medicine certainly does hold that. And if we're trying to decolonize medical humanities, as it might require to be done, we should maybe be changing the terminology. So I stand challenged on that one, shall we say, Paul?
It sounds like a productive internal conversation among those
It is.
people who are interested, whether they're on the humanities side or the medical side. That's a
Yes,
useful.
I would want to avoid sides. That's really what I'm trying to say. But if the word creates those divisions, then maybe we should seriously think about dropping it. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Jane. One
Great.
more time, please. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks very much.
Now, those of us who are here at the workshop have lunch, and then in about half an hour, we meet again for the next round of sessions, and hopefully we'll see you. And if not, we'll see you perhaps tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.